You know you've completely lost the plot of your own life when the cold, biting sensation of steel handcuffs snapping around your wrists at 6:17 in the morning feels less shocking than the sheer stupidity of the reason behind them. Standing there in my flannel pajama pants on a Tuesday with my coffee mug still steaming on the porch railing like a forgotten prop in a bad comedy sketch. Two officers from the Oak Ridge Police Department, looking absolute mortified to be there, were staring down at my weapon of mass destruction. A primitive, bladeless manual push mower that makes less noise than a whispering librarian, while Officer Reynolds awkwardly cleared his throat and told me that a frantic neighbor had reported unauthorized heavy construction machinery operating before legal hours, pointing at my silent lawn tool as if it were a jackhammer tearing up the pavement. It felt like living inside a fever dream, a satirical headline come to life. But as I looked up at the second-floor window of the house across the street and saw the blinds twitch, my blood didn't just boil, it evaporated, because Brenda Vance knew exactly what she was doing. She knew my disabled father had just moved in. She knew I was working triple shifts to keep the lights on, and she had decided that destroying my life was her new hobby. Drop a comment below if you're watching this from a place where neighbors actually act like human beings, because where I live, in the once sleepy suburb of Oak Haven Heights, common sense is an endangered species, and I'm the one being hunted. My name is Lucas, and 6 months ago, my biggest stress was just surviving 72-hour shifts as an EMT while my wife, Elena, worked opposite schedules as an ER nurse, the two of us existing like ships passing in the night, communicating through texts and the level of coffee left in the pot, just trying to pay the mortgage on a house we bought back when this neighborhood was paradise. But then my father, Arthur, a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran who lost his leg to complications from Agent Orange and diabetes, moved into our converted garage, bringing the rhythmic click-clack of his wheelchair and the smell of Old Spice into our lives. And suddenly our home felt complete, filled with purpose and the kind of chaotic love that makes the exhaustion worth it. Oak Haven Heights was built in the mid-90s, a place that smelled of charcoal grills and fabric softener, where kids played street hockey until the streetlights hummed to life. But that all changed when Brenda Vance rolled into town from the exclusive gated community of Silver Creek, driving a pristine white Mercedes SUV with vanity plates that read QUNB, creating a localized weather system of judgment and misery wherever she went. She was a failed real estate agent who treated every interaction like a hostile negotiation, a woman who didn't walk but patrolled, always clutching a leather-bound notebook and a laser measuring tape like they were religious artifacts, scanning for imperfections in a world she was desperate to control because, I assume, everything else in her life was spiraling. Within 6 months, she had maneuvered her way into the HOA presidency with a total of 23 votes because the rest of us were too busy working for a living to attend a meeting held at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, a classic corporate takeover strategy applied to suburban living. And suddenly the neighborhood didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a prison yard with better landscaping. The war didn't start with a bang, but with the squeak of rubber tires on concrete, specifically the faint, temporary tracks Arthur's wheelchair left on the sidewalk after a heavy rainstorm, marks that would vanish the second the sun came out. Yet Brenda saw them as an act of vandalism. I remember standing in my driveway, holding a letter printed on cardstock thick enough to slice a finger, reading a violation notice demanding $300 for damage to common area hardscaping, and a signed affidavit promising to limit the usage of wheeled conveyances on public paths, and the sheer audacity of it hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Realizing this woman wanted me to tell a man who left part of his body in a jungle halfway across the world that he couldn't roll down his own street because it offended her aesthetic sensibilities. When I tried to handle it like a rational adult, filing a medical accommodation request with the board, she responded not with empathy, but with a lawyer's letter threatening to place a lien on my property, transforming the gentle hum of Arthur's oxygen machine through the thin garage walls from a comforting sound into a ticking clock of financial ruin. It became crystal clear that Brenda was systematically hunting down anyone who didn't fit her vision of a catalog-perfect life, targeting the widow Mrs. Higgins because her mailbox had faded to a slightly less vibrant shade of red after 20 years of sun, citing a young couple because their toddlers laughed too loudly in their own backyard, and waging a crusade against any vehicle that looked like it did actual work. She called us legacy residents, spitting the word out like it was a diagnosis, implying that our existence was a blight on property values. And the breaking point came on a gloom Tuesday morning while Elena was crying over a bowl of cold oatmeal because she'd missed another family dinner. I watched Arthur arranging his 23 daily pills on the table, looking at me with eyes that had seen things I couldn't imagine, and he said, "Son, I didn't survive the Mekong Delta to let a suburban dictator with a bob haircut tell me where I can drive my chair." And that was the moment the switch flipped, the moment I realized we weren't just going to survive Brenda, we were going to dismantle her. 2 weeks later, the escalation moved from petty to professional when I walked out to my EMT vehicle at dawn, exhausted from a shift where I'd literally held someone's heart in my hands, only to find a neon yellow sticker zip-tied to my door handle, the plastic cutting into the paint, citing me for emergency vehicle access obstruction, with a $150 fine and a threat of immediate towing. I stood there, smelling of antiseptic and despair, staring at the citation on a vehicle that is literally designed to save lives. A vehicle I had measured the night before to be exactly 19 inches from the curb, because precision is my job, only to find that Brenda had seemingly hallucinated a new rule requiring 18 inches of clearance. The timestamp on the violation photo was 2:47 a.m., meaning this woman was prowling the streets in the dead of night like a vampire of bureaucracy while I was performing CPR, and that's when my training kicked in, specifically the part about municipal codes and hierarchy of authority. I went straight to the source, looking up the Oak Ridge City Fire Code, and discovered that actual firefighters, the people who climb ladders into burning buildings, only require 12 inches of clearance, meaning Brenda hadn't just moved the goalposts. She had invented a sport that didn't exist, creating a rule stricter than the law itself to target me specifically. I spent my next day off channeling my inner detective, walking the neighborhood with a tape measure like I was investigating a crime scene, documenting that Mike the contractor's van was at 17 inches, the electrician's truck at 16, all in violation of her imaginary rule, but the smoking gun was Brenda's own Mercedes, parked a jagged 14 inches from the curb, crooked as a politician's promise. She was selectively enforcing rules against the working class while living above the law, and when I presented this evidence at the next board meeting, along with a letter from the Oak Ridge fire marshal stating her rule was actually dangerous, the look on her face was worth every second of lost sleep. She sat there, rigid as a mannequin, her perfectly manicured nails drumming a frantic rhythm on the table as I read the fire marshal's email aloud, watching the other board members, particularly Janet, look from the evidence to Brenda with the dawning realization that they were following a lunatic. We won that vote 4-2, a victory that tasted like cold brew coffee and justice. But as Brenda gathered her papers with trembling hands, she looked me dead in the eye and whispered about enhanced enforcement protocols, a phrase that sounded less like policy and more like a threat. 3 days later, the real war began when she slapped a violation on my door for grass height, claiming my lawn was 3.2 inches when the new limit was 3 inches, knowing full well my work schedule left me zero time to mow. But she had forgotten that she was picking a fight with a man who navigates chaos for a living, and I was about to turn her obsession with rules into her absolute nightmare. The audacity of the grass violation wasn't in the measurement itself, but in the calculated cruelty of the timing, because Brenda Vance had clearly been tracking our shifts, noting the exact hours Elena and I were comatose from exhaustion, and she struck precisely when she knew we were weakest, demanding professional landscaping or facing escalating fines that would cripple us. But I'm a stubborn son of a gun, and if there is one thing EMT training teaches you, it's that if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. So I decided to treat this neighborhood dispute like a complex trauma case, requiring surgical precision and overwhelming evidence. I grabbed my phone and my own ruler, crouching in the dewy grass of Oak Haven Heights like a forensic analyst, measuring blade heights across the entire subdivision, discovering that Brenda's own pristine lawn was sitting at a shaggy 4.1 inches and her wealthy friends in the cul-de-sac were pushing 3.8, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the laws of physics and HOA bylaws only applied to the people she deemed unworthy. It was time for malicious compliance, the kind that makes a military drill sergeant shed a single tear of pride, So I memorized the city noise ordinance, which stated that residential maintenance was legal starting at 6 a.m., not a minute sooner, and I bought that silent, human-powered push mower. Every single morning, at exactly 6 a.m., while the rest of the world was hitting snooze, I was out there in the gray dawn light, pushing that mower in a zen-like trance, cutting my grass to precisely 2.75 inches, the absolute sweet spot of her arbitrary regulation, and documenting it with time-stamped photos that I emailed to the entire board with cheery subject lines like Compliance Update, Tuesday. It was a beautiful, quiet rebellion, a daily reminder that I was following her rules harder and better than she ever could, and it started to drive her absolutely insane. I could see her silhouette in the bedroom window, clutching a stopwatch, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for a single toe to cross the line, but I was operating with the accuracy of a heart surgeon. The neighborhood began to wake up, not just from sleep, but from the spell of fear she had cast, with Mike the contractor offering free repairs to anyone on Brenda's hit list, and Mrs. Higgins baking resistance cookies for our strategy sessions, transforming the atmosphere from isolated paranoia to a simmering community revolt. We discovered that Brenda was actually using strict HOA standards as a selling point in her real estate listings, literally monetizing our misery, which gave us the final piece of the puzzle we needed to understand her motivation. This wasn't just about control, it was about cash. So, I decided to hit her where it hurt, researching municipal infrastructure until I found a proposal for waste management route optimization that had been languishing in a city council drawer for years. I met with Mr. Clark at the city traffic engineering department, a man who loved efficiency more than he loved his own family. And I pointed out that the current garbage truck route required dangerous backing maneuvers that could be solved by simply looping the heavy trucks past Silver Creek Drive, Brenda Street. I sold it as a safety improvement for the children, a way to streamline the city budget, and I didn't mention even once that it would send the recycling truck, the trash compactor, and the yard waste hauler rumbling past Brenda's master bedroom window at 6:15, 6:22, and 6:28 a.m. respectively. The change was approved within the week, and suddenly, the woman who loved to police noise was waking up to a diesel-fueled symphony of hydraulic compactors and air brakes every single morning. A karmic alarm clock that she couldn't find, couldn't threaten, and couldn't stop. While she was frantically calling the city to complain about the noise of essential government services, we were building an army, a private Facebook group called the Oak Haven Alliance, that grew from 5 disgruntled neighbors to 28 families in a matter of days, sharing stories that painted a picture of a tyrant out of control. We had people terrified to paint their front doors, people fined for holiday decorations that were up for 25 hours past the season. And through it all, Brenda was watching us, her paranoia growing like a toxic mold. She escalated, calling an emergency board meeting with zero legal notice to pass a community safety rule banning coordinated resident complaints, essentially trying to outlaw our friendship, a move so unconstitutional it would have been funny if the fines weren't $500 a pop. That's when I knew she was desperate. So I dug deeper, spending my lunch breaks in the dusty basement of the county courthouse, pulling the original 1995 charter for our community, and what I found made my hands shake with adrenaline. The original bylaws, yellowed and brittle, stated clearly that the maximum fine for any violation was capped at $25, and any change to that amount required a 60% vote from the entire residency, a vote that had never happened. Brenda had been charging people hundreds of dollars, collecting nearly $50,000 in fines over 3 years, and funneling it into an account that, according to the records, she controlled exclusively, bypassing the treasurer entirely. I was looking at grand larceny, embezzlement, and fraud on a scale that would put her behind bars, not just out of office, and I texted Elena a picture of the ledger with the caption, "I found the nuclear codes." But Brenda, sensing the walls closing in, decided to go nuclear first, and that brings us back to the handcuffs, the police cruisers, and the manual mower. She had called 911, lying to the dispatcher that I was operating heavy construction machinery, trying to get me arrested to ruin my professional license, to destroy my credibility before I could expose hers. As Officer Reynolds uncuffed me, realizing he had been weaponized by a suburban sociopath, he told me quietly that they had been receiving dozens of false reports from her, and that filing a false police report was a misdemeanor that they were now very interested in pursuing. I stood in my driveway, rubbing my wrists, watching the neighbors emerge from their houses. Mike, Mrs. Higgins, Jessica, all holding phones, recording the truth, and I looked up at Brenda's window one last time, realizing she hadn't just lost the battle. She had just handed me the ammunition to end the war permanently. The flyers appeared in mailboxes on a gloomy Monday, professionally printed on glossy stock that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, featuring a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my face next to headlines that screamed "Neighborhood Safety Alert" and "Elder Abuse Risk." Brenda Vance had officially crossed the Rubicon, accusing me, an active-duty EMT, of using my medical access to intimidate vulnerable seniors, twisting a photo of me helping Mrs. Patterson during her diabetic seizure 3 weeks prior into a narrative that I was harassing her. It was a move born of pure, distilled desperation, a character assassination attempt so vile it felt like breathing in toxic smoke. But it was also the dumbest thing she had ever done, because she had just committed libel in writing against a licensed medical professional, and the backlash was instantaneous and violent. Mrs. Patterson, a woman who usually saved her energy for bingo, was so incensed she wrote an open letter defending me that Jessica printed and taped to every lamppost in Oak Haven, turning Brenda's propaganda into a recruitment tool for our cause. The board meeting that Friday was less of a gathering and more of a reckoning, with 73 residents packing into a community center room designed for 40, the air thick with the smell of cheap coffee and revolution. Brenda sat at the front table, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he charged by the heavy sigh, still trying to project the icy authority of a queen addressing her unruly subjects, banging her gavel and talking about disruptive elements and preserving property values. I waited until she finished her opening monologue, feeling the weight of the thick file folder in my hands, feeling the eyes of Arthur, Elena, and every neighbor she had ever tormented burning into my back, and then I stood up, hooked up my laptop to the projector, and dropped the bomb. When the original 1995 bylaws hit the screen, specifically the highlighted section capping fines at $25, the room didn't just gasp, it erupted, a collective sound of shock as people mentally calculated the thousands of dollars they had been robbed of. I didn't stop there. I walked them through the unauthorized rule changes, the lack of voting records, and then, with the calmness of a surgeon explaining a diagnosis, I pulled up the financial records showing $47,000 in collected fines and the correspondent withdrawals for landscaping consulting at Brenda's personal address and legal retainers for her private real estate deals. The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous, the sound of a mob realizing they hadn't just been annoyed, they had been robbed. Amanda Ross, the attorney we had brought in, stood up and calmly informed the board that a class action lawsuit was being filed for the return of all funds, and that the state attorney general's office had already been notified of the irregularities. Then, the coup de grace. The state investigator, Lisa, who had been quietly sitting in the back row, stood up and announced that all HOA accounts were frozen pending a criminal fraud investigation. Brenda's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, denial, panic, before settling on a hollow, pale defeat as her own lawyer started packing his briefcase, clearly realizing his retainer check was about to bounce. The vote to remove her was swift, brutal, and nearly unanimous, with 71 votes to 2. And as she stormed out of the room to the sound of thunderous applause, stripped of her title and her power, the spell over Oak Haven finally broke. In the months that followed, the neighborhood underwent a detox. The for sale signs vanished. The white BMW disappeared forever, along with her real estate license, which was revoked following the fraud conviction, and the silence of fear was replaced by the noise of life. Kids screaming on trampolines, music from backyard barbecues, and the beautiful, rhythmic sound of Arthur's wheelchair rolling freely down sidewalks that no longer belonged to a tyrant. We recovered $43,000, money that went back to the family she stole from, with enough left over to build a community park where we now hold the annual Oak Haven Block Revival, a potluck that celebrates the fact that we survived. I'm the president now, a job I never wanted but do happily, presiding over meetings that are mostly just excuses to eat Mrs. Higgins' cookies and talk about actual maintenance issues. And every morning at 6:20 a.m., As I sip my coffee, I watch the garbage trucks rumble past the house where Brenda used to live, a heavy, noisy reminder that justice sometimes sounds like a diesel engine. But as I sit here on my porch, watching Arthur teach the neighbor's kid how to play chess, I can't help but wonder about the thin line between order and tyranny. Brenda genuinely believed she was the hero, that her rules were the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. And while she was undeniably a villain, it makes you ask a hard question: at what point does protecting the community become destroying the people who live in it? We won, and the bad guy lost. But in a world where power so easily corrupts, how long until the next person with a measuring tape and a little bit of authority decides that their version of perfect is more important than your right to exist? Tell me what you think. Was the trash truck revenge too far, or was it the perfect poetic justice? Hit that like button if you hate HOAs, and subscribe for more stories about the little guy fighting back. I'm Lucas, and I'll see you in the next one.